Anyway, my talk today is going to be about the yin and yang of public policy. So our lives are made up of the choices that we make, and some of these choices are mundane, like what to wear or what to eat, but others are very profound, and they have large impacts on our life. And the Taoists believe that to have prosperity and happiness in your life, that the forces of nature need to be balanced in your life. The yin and the yang need to be balanced. And so, the yin is the mother, the whole, the feminine, and the yang is the aggressor, the male, and we need to balance these things. We need to balance the good and the evil, the dark and the light, and the male and the female in our lives. So in her book, Envisioning a New World, UU Minister Rosemary Canarias applies this concept of balance to public policy, and I thought this was actually very profound when I read this, because she says that we should consciously balance individual liberty, the yang, the male, balance that individual liberty with the yin, the mother, the whole. And so she says we should balance individual liberty and social responsibility in our policies. And it sounds like a very simple concept, but when you think about it, it's a very profound concept, and one that we're not necessarily following with our policies in this country. So she goes on to point out in her book that even in our country's Declaration of Independence, quote, "For the first time in history, an individual's right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness was proclaimed divinely ordained and unassailable and constitutionally guaranteed." This was a huge step forward for the common man in the 1700s. Yes, women were not included, and not all men were included, but still in a world dominated by monarchies, this was a big idea. So lest our country become overrun with unbridled individualism, the framers of the Constitution balanced individual liberty with they balanced, quote, "the ascendancy of the individual with the trust in humanity's capacity for self-governance." So democracy, the voice of the people, the vote, was to balance individual liberty, and that's how the government was set up. And to keep everybody informed, they put in the freedom of the press in there. In fact, Thomas Jefferson wanted the newspaper to be mailed to all citizens to make sure that we were all informed. How far from that ideal have we come, right? And so, although we often hear that our country is divided, but when we strip away the political hype, we often find that there is general agreement on some basic issues. We don't necessarily agree on the strategies to get there, but we often agree on the big issues. For example, affordable and equitable health care. Most people want that, right? Quality public education, also a very popular idea. Background checks for gun purchases, also relatively well accepted across the country. Access to contraception and guaranteed voter rights. All of these things are pretty much things that Americans agree on. Unfortunately, lawmakers continue to pass laws that go against what we want, right? So what happened to our democratic utopia? Individual liberty and social responsibility are out of balance, in my opinion. Big money politics, voter suppression, disinformation, and the slow death of the free press have adulterated our democracy and put special interests in charge. You can see it up front and personal. If you ever stop in the lobby of the Arizona House, you can see who's in charge and who's making the deals right there, right? So if you look at certain policies like gun control, school choice, environmental regulations, and the Affordable Care Act repeal, you'll see that if you look at it through the prism of liberty versus responsibility, you'll see that a lot of these policies are overweighted towards individual liberty, and they're leaving out the social responsibility part of that equation. On the other hand, on some policies like abortion restrictions, voter suppression, and jail for minor drug offenses, those are going the other way, where there's a group that is oppressing the individual. So this imbalance in our public policy can go each way. So I'm going to go over just a few policies and play out this scenario of balance. So first of all is gun control. So Congress has perpetually avoided meaningful reform in gun control, and at the Arizona legislature, pretty much every bill that promotes more guns is passed. So in Arizona in particular, the individual liberty trumps social responsibility when it comes to the Second Amendment rights. So unfortunately, tipping the scale so heavily toward individualism in the gun control issue has made us less safe as a country. A recent Centers for Disease Control study found that it looked at homicides of 10,000 women, and they found that half of these women were killed with a gun by their male partners, half of them. Along the same lines, there was a study that was published in the American Journal of Medicine where I worked, and it looked at violent death in 22 countries. And across those 22 countries, 90% of the women who died of violent death were shot in the United States. That's a policy that is out of balance. 80% of the children that were shot across 22 countries were shot, where 80% of children who died of violent death were shot in the United States. So we need a balanced policy when it comes to gun control. The author, writing in the American Journal of Medicine, said firearms are killing us rather than protecting us. And so these mass murders, the fatal traffic stops, the family tragedies, these things need to stop. We need to balance that policy, in my opinion. School choice is another one. School choice is another one where often individual liberty trumps what's good for the community, right? Special interest groups have sold the idea that only the parent can decide what the kid needs to learn, and only the parent can decide where the kid goes to school. And this special interest philosophy has been taken to the extreme in some ways, in that now we have taxpayer money being diverted to private schools and religious schools to the detriment of the public schools. So do parents have the right to choose where their where their children go to school? Of course they do. Does the public have to pay for a private school education? No, we don't have to pay for it. Our taxes pay for public education. That's what we're offering to your children. We're going to guarantee that it's a good quality education. If you want something else, you pay for it yourself, in my opinion. And that would be a balanced policy. Environmental regulations. If you want to look at social responsibility versus liberty, this is the big issue, because this affects everybody across the globe, right? I read in the paper today that it's been 10 years since Al Gore produced An Inconvenient Truth. And that woke a lot of people up to climate change and extinction and things like that, and people seem to be a little energized. Well, what's happened since then is that, according to Al Gore being quoted in The Guardian today, he said that the large carbon producers have spent billions of dollars to cast doubt on the idea of climate change. And so what you have is a war, an information war against climate science, and really against science in general, right? Currently, our federal government is controlled by climate deniers at all levels, and many of them campaigned on a platform of stepping back from international treaties, from dismantling the Environmental Protection Agency, eliminating or weakening environmental regulations, reducing wildlife protections, reducing the number of national monuments and protected areas, and even opening up national monuments and parks like the Grand Canyon. We had a vote on this in the Arizona House to open up the Grand Canyon to exploitation and drilling. Now, really, how many of the general public would want to see a drilling rig at the bottom of the Grand Canyon? I don't think there's that many of us, but there are people who believe we have too many trees. I had somebody tell me this. We're just too many trees. It's a waste of resources. They tell me it's a waste of resources not to exploit the public lands for oil and gas refining and drilling. And it's shocking to me when they talk like this, you know. And I grew up on Lake Erie, and I have many memories of playing in the lake and boating, but I also remember by the time I got to junior high, the beaches of Lake Erie were strewn with dead perch. I mean, Larry, I was going like this, trying to not step on dead fish, going to the beach, and I remember asking my mom, why are there all these dead fish on the beach? And she gave, in her, typical German way, she said, kind of a shit happens, kind of a, that's how it is, kind of a explanation, because I don't think they thought about those factories ringing Lake Erie and all the pollution they were dumping into the lake and the Cuyahoga River, which infamously burned back in the 60s. And so the EPA, I don't want to live a life without the EPA, really, because I remember life before the EPA. And that was an attempt at a balanced policy because the polluters were supposed to pay for what they did. Those factories along Lake Erie are gone, but you can swim in Lake Erie because of the EPA. And I don't want to go back to life without it. So another issue is the Affordable Care Act repeal. We dodged a big bullet this week on this, right? And John McCain infamously said, well, I said I would vote for something that covered more people and was cheaper, and this isn't it. Well, thank God he told the truth, Again, since the early 1900s, special interests have been trying to stop meaningful health insurance reform in the United States, and they've been pretty much successful. The Affordable Care Act, with all of its warts, was an attempt at balanced policy. So it was a step in the right direction because it dramatically increased coverage. It also eliminated the pre-existing conditions. It eliminated gender-based pricing discrimination. It eliminated lifetime insurance caps. It mandated health care package that was focused on prevention. Our medical system is expensive because we're going to figure out what to do with you once you get sick. We're not going to try to help you prevent disease. And the Affordable Care Act was a step at helping you prevent disease in your lifetime. It also included the fees that we're supposed to pay for it. And so it was, like I said, it was an attempt at balanced policy because you had the insurance companies and the wealthy were paying more into it to pay for care for the rest of us. But as we see, as it played out and insurance companies left the system, obviously reform was needed. So, what we saw in the Congress was repeal and replace, or death by 1,000 cuts. But the people, every day people were saying on Facebook, I'm calling my congressman, I'm doing this, and we had protests at John McCain's offices last week because the people didn't want 30 million other Americans to be thrown off of health insurance. They were promised a better deal, and what they were being given was not a better deal. It would have less coverage, it would have been more expensive, and we stood back and we fought for the common good, and we stopped it, at least for now. So there was a recent Associated Press story that said 80% of Americans want a nonpartisan solution to the health insurance problem. And so I think it's time for people to start working in a nonpartisan way to bring us better care and to cover more people. Because a plan that throws people off of insurance will cause unnecessary disease, premature death, and bankruptcy. Obviously, the imbalance in those sorts of policies is glaring. We need balanced policies. We need to make the Affordable Care Act better rather than throwing the baby out with the bathwater. So to wrap it up, we hear in the news about, that we're a country divided. We hear on social media that, there's all these stories of, politics and ideology, and all this has brought a stalemate, particularly in Congress. So despite mounting needs, we see stalemates, and we see laws that we don't necessarily like. And so it's no wonder that people are upset. Again, the Taoists believe to attain health in your body and in your community, you have to have balance. And without balance, there is dis-ease. So I'm wondering, are the anger, the bullying, the hatred, the violence that we see, are these symptoms of societal dis-ease in our country? Because so many people are upset with the laws. right? The laws are unfair to many groups because the laws are made by a very small group of very powerful, very wealthy people. And so, again, it doesn't matter if you have a D or an R or a G or an L or a P or a C or an S or an O behind your name. There are people who are upset about some of the same issues. And I think if we had balance in our policies, we'd have less anger because the people would be better served by our policies. So I think the idea of balancing individual liberty with social responsibility seems so simple but so profound. And if you stop and think about all the policies, really, and start thinking about, is this a balanced policy or not? Are people upset about this? You can come up with a list of 20 policies right off the bat. I only limit it to 4 here. So could we balance the policies and solve some of the tension in our country? I think it's worth a try. I think it's time to say no to special interests and yes to what's good for the people of the United States. Thank you.